I did not arrive in Jerusalem with questions. I arrived with instructions, a small bundle of cloth, and the careful quiet that comes from knowing your place has already been decided. At first, the city felt like stone and breath, walls that held the sun, courtyards that carried sound in soft echoes. Everything was ordered, measured. Nothing seemed rushed, and nothing felt careless. Even the servants moved as if time itself had learned to walk more slowly here. I was young then, not foolish, but unshaped. I had been told what Solomon was before I ever saw him, a king of peace, a king of wisdom, a man whose words carried weight without force. People spoke his name the way they speak of something stable, something that would not move beneath their feet. When I was brought into the household, I learned quickly that silence was valued. Not fear-filled silence, not the kind that trembles, but a listening silence, a kind that makes room. I watched before I spoke. I listened before I formed opinions. There were many of us, women from different places, with different ways of standing, different prayers folded into our memory. Some arrived before me, some after. We did not compete. There was no need. Affection here did not feel scarce. It felt thinly spread, like oil brushed across too much surface. In those early days, Solomon still walked the halls without hurry. He greeted people by name when he could. He paused when spoken to. When elders visited, he listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his voice was calm, almost gentle. I remember the first time I heard him speak wisdom aloud. Not to me, never to me, but nearby, close enough that the words rested in the air between rooms. He spoke of patience, of restraint, of how a house is built slowly, not loudly. Those words stayed with me because the house itself seemed to agree. Nothing here felt excessive yet. The wealth was real, but it was ordered. Gold did not shout. It sat quietly where it was placed. I learned the rhythms: morning light in the inner courts, evening quiet near the gardens, meals shared without ceremony unless visitors were present. Solomon was not distant then. He was contained. His presence felt gathered, not scattered. When I saw him close, he looked tired in a way that did not worry me. A good tired, the kind that comes from listening deeply, from holding responsibility with both hands. His eyes were observant. He noticed things others overlooked, a servant's hesitation, a disagreement that had not yet formed words. I remember thinking, without saying it, that wisdom was not loud at all. It simply paid attention. Among us, the women, there was little drama in those early years. We lived alongside one another like different seasons sharing the same sky. Some were joyful, some carried private sorrow. No one was surprised by either. I did not expect to be known. I did not expect to be chosen. I expected steadiness, and for a time that expectation was met. Sometimes I walked the corridors and listened to Solomon teach his son. The boy was small then, curious, restless. Solomon's voice softened when he spoke to him. He explained things slowly, not as commands, but as observations. "Look," he would say, and then he would wait. I learned much just from that waiting. I was not from Israel. My accent softened over time, but never fully disappeared. I learned the prayers by listening before I learned the words. I learned who their God was by watching how they spoke of him when they thought no one else was listening. There was reverence here, not perfection, but reverence. People believed that wisdom was a gift, not a possession. At night, when lamps were low, I sometimes wondered why I had been brought here, not in bitterness, just curiosity. I did not feel used. I did not feel cherished either. I felt placed. There is a kind of safety in that. When expectation is clear, the heart does not strain as much. In those early days, Solomon still seemed aware of limits. He spoke of them often, the limits of anger, the limits of desire, the limits of speech. He warned others gently, not as a judge, but as someone who had looked over an edge and stepped back. I believed him. We believed him. When visitors came from distant lands, I watched how they watched him. They leaned forward. They listened closely. They came with questions prepared and left with silence, as if something in them had been settled. It made me proud to belong here, even quietly, even unnoticed. I thought wisdom would protect us all, not from sorrow, but from excess. In the stillness of those early years, I felt part of something careful, a household that knew how to pause, a king who knew how to listen. I did not yet understand how easily fullness can become weight, how attention once divided begins to thin without anyone intending it. But in the beginning there was balance, and I rested inside it without fear. The days passed slowly then, and I believed they always would. The years settled in, the household grew without announcing itself. At first it was small changes. A new wing opened, another courtyard finished, more footsteps in the halls at hours that used to be quiet. None of it felt wrong. Growth rarely does when it comes gently. Solomon remained attentive. He still listened, still paused, but his pauses shortened. His listening became more selective, though I could not have named it then. I only felt it as a subtle shift, like a breeze that no longer moved through every room. More women arrived, not suddenly, not in a flood, just steadily, one after another, each bringing her own language, her own posture, her own unspoken hopes. The household adjusted, as households do. Servants learned new routines, schedules stretched. Affection did not disappear, it redistributed. I learned to recognize days by sound. Some days were full of voices and visitors. Other days carried a hush that felt rehearsed, as if quiet had been instructed to remain in place. Solomon began to travel more. When he returned, he brought stories of alliances, agreements, understandings reached without conflict. People praised him for this. They said peace followed him like a shadow. I watched him listen to foreign leaders with interest that felt genuine. He asked about their customs, their gods, not with judgment, but curiosity. At first, this seemed like wisdom to me, understanding before response. He had always valued that. But curiosity, like wealth, does not always know when to stop gathering. In the early years, Solomon's wisdom felt rooted. Later, it began to feel wide. Wide is not the same as deep. I did not think this thought clearly at the time. It came to me as a feeling instead, a sense that something once held close was now being carried with one hand while the other reached outward. The household reflected this change. Rooms filled, schedules overlapped, faces blurred. There were days I did not see Solomon at all. There were weeks when his presence felt like something remembered rather than experienced. Still, when he spoke, people listened. Still, when he judged, it was fair. Wisdom does not leave all at once. It lingers. I remember one evening when he passed near the garden where I was walking. He did not stop, but he nodded, just once. His eyes met mine briefly. There was no warmth, no coldness, just acknowledgement. That was enough. I learned then that being seen did not always mean being held in mind. Sometimes it only meant being counted. Among the women, the atmosphere shifted quietly, not toward rivalry, but toward distance. We became careful with one another, not guarded, just aware that closeness no longer offered safety. Attention had become something that moved unpredictably. Some women hoped loudly, some withdrew. I remained where I had always been, present, observant, unremarkable. I began to notice how wisdom was spoken now, less as invitation, more as declaration. When Solomon taught publicly, the words were still true, they still landed with weight, but they no longer felt drawn from silence. They felt prepared, polished, ready. People praised him now more. Praise gathers quickly when it senses expansion. I heard servants speak of new projects, new cities, new storehouses. The kingdom was growing, they said, prosperous, secure. At night, when lamps burned longer than before, I wondered if security ever noticed how much space it required. I did not judge Solomon. Judgment requires distance, and I was too close. Instead, I carried small observations like stones in my pocket, unheavy on their own, accumulating. One evening, I overheard a conversation between Solomon and a visiting dignitary. They spoke of gods, plural. The words were respectful, curious, balanced. Solomon listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions. There was no devotion in his tone, only interest. Still, I felt something tighten. Not fear, recognition. I had learned long ago that attention shapes affection over time. What we linger with begins to claim us quietly. The God of Israel was still honored here. The prayers continued, the rituals remained. Nothing had been removed, but something new had been added. An addition changes the weight of things. The household adjusted again, always adjusting. That became its skill. I learned where to walk to avoid crowds. I learned which hours belonged to which people. I learned how to feel content without expecting nearness. This was not sorrow, it was adaptation. Solomon still possessed wisdom, but wisdom, when spread thin, becomes harder to feel. There were moments when I missed the early stillness, the sense that everything here had been built slowly, with listening at its center. Now, listening competed with management, presence competed with responsibility. One night, I sat alone and remembered his words from years ago, about limits, about restraint. I wondered if wisdom had taught him those limits, or if humility had. I did not ask. I did not speak these thoughts out loud. In a household this large, silence is not emptiness, it is participation. And so I remained, watching, learning, not yet grieving, not yet releasing, just noticing how fullness changes shape when it grows beyond what the hands can hold. There came a season. Time did not announce its passing. It gathered quietly, the way dust gathers on high shelves, unnoticed until the light shifts. By then, the household no longer felt like a single place. It felt like many places stitched together by corridors and schedules. I learned that distance can exist even indoors, that proximity does not guarantee closeness. It only removes the excuse for absence. Solomon was still spoken of with reverence beyond the walls. His name carried authority. His judgments were sought. His sayings traveled farther than he did. People repeated his words as if they were stones placed carefully along a path. Inside the household, those words lived differently. They were still true, but truth, when repeated often enough, can begin to sound like something already finished. I noticed that Solomon no longer walked without escort, not because he feared harm, but because his presence now required arrangement. People anticipated him rather than encountered him. Every movement had consequence. Every pause belonged to someone waiting. Wisdom had become visible. Visibility changes things. There were days when he passed through a room and the air shifted before he entered. Servants straightened, voices softened, movements became precise. Order followed him like a practiced response. I wondered sometimes whether he felt that shift too, whether he missed being able to enter a space without altering it. In the early years, Solomon's attention had felt like a gift freely given. Now it felt like a resource. I did not resent this. I understood it. A kingdom expands, a household follows. More shrines appeared at the edges of the city, not declared, not central, small places at first, maintained quietly. People spoke of them without urgency, as accommodations, as gestures of peace. Nothing felt forced. I passed one once on a longer walk than usual. I did not enter. I only noticed how ordinary it looked, how easily it fit into the landscape. That was what unsettled me most, not the presence of something new, but how quickly it felt familiar. Within the household, customs layered over one another, different rhythms of prayer, different celebrations. No one was told to abandon what they had known. Everyone was allowed to keep something. Allowance can feel generous. It can also feel unanchored. Solomon spoke often of balance now, of holding many things without letting any one thing rule. His words were careful, thoughtful, reasonable. I believed he meant them. But I also knew that holding many things requires hands that never tire, and even the strongest hands eventually ache. I rarely saw him alone anymore. When I did, his face carried a stillness that felt guarded, not hardened, just protected, as if solitude had become something he had to defend rather than enter freely. Once, as he passed nearby, I heard him sigh, not deeply, not loudly, just enough to register. It stayed with me. I realized then that wisdom does not remove weight. It teaches you how to carry it longer. Among the women, some had learned to position themselves closer to favor. Others withdrew into private routines. A few left quietly, sent away to other households, other arrangements. Life continued. I remained, not because I was chosen, but because I was not inconvenient. There is a particular invisibility that comes with stability. When you do not disrupt, you're allowed to stay. I listened more than ever, not to conversations meant for me, but to the spaces between them. I noticed how often Solomon spoke of legacy now, of what would remain, of how his name would be remembered. These thoughts did not feel proud. They felt heavy, as if he were trying to settle something that would not rest. The God of Israel was still honored in the great places. The festivals continued. The prayers rose as they always had. But devotion had become organized, scheduled, managed. I remembered when reverence had felt closer to listening than to structure. One evening, I sat where I could hear Solomon teaching again. His voice was steady, confident. The people listened intently. Some wrote his words down, some nodded, as if agreement itself was a form of faithfulness. I listened too, and I realized that wisdom, when spoken from a place of abundance, begins to sound different than wisdom spoken from dependence. It is not less true, but it lands differently. I did not long for the past. Longing can distort memory. I simply recognized that something had shifted, and that shift had settled into permanence. The household still functioned, the kingdom still prospered, peace remained. But peace, like wisdom, can become familiar enough that its absence would be felt more sharply than its presence. At night, when the halls quieted, I sometimes asked myself why I noticed these things, why they stayed with me when others seemed content. I did not answer. Some people are placed in proximity not to change events, but to remember what they felt like before they became settled. I carried that remembering quietly, not as an accusation, not as a warning, as witness. And in that witnessing, I learned something about belonging. Belonging does not always mean being close to what is happening. Sometimes it means staying long enough to see how it changes. I stayed, not because I expected return, but because leaving would have required certainty. And certainty, I had learned, rarely lives where wisdom grows heavy. So I remained in the household, moving gently through its widening spaces, holding memory like a thread that had not yet been pulled. Not yet. There was still time. There came a season when I understood that growth does not always feel like movement. From the outside, everything continued. The kingdom remained strong, the city remained full. Solomon's name still carried the same weight when spoken. But inside the household, time began to feel layered, as if the past and present were sharing the same rooms without speaking to one another. I had learned the sound of fullness by then, the way it hums quietly, even when nothing is being said. There were more servants now than I could name, more schedules than I could follow, more customs resting side by side, each one treated carefully so none would feel dismissed. Care had become a skill here, so had accommodation. Solomon himself seemed carved by responsibility. His posture was still upright, his voice still steady, but something in his eyes had learned how to hold distance, not coldness, distance. I wondered when that had happened. There is never a single day. I remember one morning when the air felt especially still, not peaceful, just settled, the kind of stillness that comes when movement has already been decided elsewhere. Solomon passed through the courtyard with advisors on either side. They spoke quietly, efficiently. There was no laughter among them, no tension either, just purpose. I stood back, as I always did. As he walked past, I realized that I no longer expected him to notice me. The thought arrived without sadness. Expectation had slowly released its grip. That release felt like relief. I had watched others struggle against that moment, the moment when hope realizes it has been surviving on habit rather than promise. Some hardened, some became sharp, some learned how to ask for attention without speaking. I did none of those things. I had learned that presence does not require recognition to be real. Solomon's wisdom was still sought daily. People came with disputes, questions, uncertainty. He answered patiently, fairly, often brilliantly. No one could say he had lost what God had given him. But I noticed how often those answers were now delivered from a distance, elevated, not physically, but inwardly, as if wisdom had taken its place beside authority rather than beside listening. I did not believe this was intentional. Nothing dangerous ever begins that way. In the evenings, I sometimes walked the long corridors alone. The lamps burned evenly, casting soft light against stone. The walls held stories I would never hear spoken aloud. The laughter, the grief, the negotiations, the small betrayals that come with scale. Scale changes what is visible. It also changes what is personal. There were moments when I thought of leaving, not in urgency, just consideration. Other households existed, other arrangements. Life did not end at these walls. But leaving would have required explaining myself, and I had no explanation that felt true enough to carry aloud. I was not unhappy. I was not content either. I was steady. I realized then that steadiness can sometimes be mistaken for peace. Others assume you are settled because you are quiet. They do not ask what it costs you to remain that way. One night, there was music in a distant court, a celebration for visitors. I listened from far away. The sound traveled softly, losing its shape as it passed through arches and doorways. It occurred to me that this was how many things traveled now, diluted by distance, not lost, just changed. I thought again of Solomon's early teachings, of how he spoke of knowing when enough was enough, of how he once warned that multiplication, if left unchecked, does not strengthen love, it thins it. I wondered if he remembered those words the same way I did. Memory, I learned, is shaped by where you stand when you recall it. Solomon stood at the center of many things now. I stood at the edge of one. Neither position was wrong. They were simply different. The God of Israel was still present in the great ceremonies. His name was spoken with reverence. Offerings were made carefully. Nothing appeared broken. But devotion had begun to feel shared rather than singular, spread across obligations, alliances, understandings. God was honored among many honors. I did not fear this. Fear exaggerates. I simply noticed the quiet shift in gravity. Some evenings I spoke prayers aloud in my own language, not because I rejected the prayers of Israel, but because my heart still recognized certain rhythms more easily than others. I trusted that God understood this better than anyone. I did not feel distant from him. If anything, I felt closer. There is a closeness that comes when outward belonging loosens, when you stop measuring yourself by position and begin listening inwardly again. I had not chosen this path consciously. It had unfolded around me. One day, as I passed through a less used courtyard, I noticed weeds pushing through stone, small, stubborn, unnoticed. No one had intended for them to grow there. No one had removed them either. They did not damage the stones. They only revealed where attention had shifted. I stood there longer than necessary. I understood then that decline does not always announce itself with collapse. Sometimes it arrives as neglect, quiet and patient. Solomon was still a good king, still wise, still capable. But wisdom, when surrounded by abundance, must work harder to remain attentive. I carried no accusation in this thought, only clarity. I returned to my place that evening with a strange sense of calm, not because things were resolved, but because I had stopped waiting for them to be. Waiting had softened into watching, and watching, I learned, does not always lead to action. Sometimes it simply deepens understanding. I remained where I was, not clinging, not withdrawing, just present. And in that presence, something in me settled, not resignation, acceptance. I had come to understand the shape of this life, and understanding, even when quiet, has a way of easing the heart. So I stayed. Not because I expected change, but because I had learned how to live truthfully inside what was already here. Time did not announce its passing. There is a point when familiarity stops feeling like shelter and begins to feel like weight. I did not notice the moment it happened. I only know that one day I realized I could walk the length of the household without sensing where I truly belonged within it. Every place was known to me, and yet none of them held me in particular. Solomon had aged, not suddenly, gently. His hair carried more gray. His steps remained steady, but his movements were economical now, as if he conserved energy for what mattered most. When he spoke, people leaned in as they always had. His voice still carried authority, still shaped decisions, Nothing outward had diminished, and yet something in the atmosphere had settled into permanence. The household no longer adjusted to change, it assumed it. New customs no longer felt new, they were absorbed quickly, folded into routine. What once would have drawn quiet attention now passed without comment. The extraordinary had become expected. I learned that expectation is a powerful thing. It reshapes what we notice. It dulls what once stirred us. Solomon's wisdom had become institutional, quoted, referenced, preserved. People spoke of it as something established, something secure enough to lean on without questioning its source. I wondered sometimes whether he felt that shift himself, whether he missed the days when wisdom had felt like listening rather than pronouncement. I did not ask. I did not presume closeness where none existed. Among the women, the rhythms had settled too. Some had grown accustomed to their places. Others lived quietly with disappointment they no longer named. The sharp edges had softened. Time does that. It does not heal everything, but it rounds what cannot be resolved. I noticed that conversations had become careful, not fearful, just aware. Everyone understood the weight of words now. In a household this large, words travel. They are repeated, altered, carried beyond their original intent. Silence felt safer. I did not resent this. I understood it. One afternoon, I passed near a place where offerings were prepared. The movements were practiced, precise. No one hurried, no one hesitated. Everything was done correctly. Correctness has a sound. It is smooth, unbroken. And yet, as I watched, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not sorrow, not anger, a quiet distance. I realized then that I missed the early unevenness, the moments when things had felt slightly uncertain, when listening had mattered more than efficiency, when wisdom had emerged in pauses rather than schedules. I did not believe God had left this place. I believed we had learned how to manage His presence. That thought did not frighten me. It saddened me gently. Solomon still honored the God of Israel publicly. He still spoke of him with respect. He still acknowledged the source of his wisdom. No one could accuse him of abandonment. But acknowledgement, I learned, is not the same as dependence. Dependence bends the knee inwardly. Acknowledgement stands upright. Solomon stood very upright now. There were days when I watched him and felt a strange compassion, not pity, compassion, the kind that recognizes the cost of carrying many things well for a long time, the cost of being the answer for others while quietly losing the space to ask your own questions. Power, I learned, narrows the places where uncertainty is allowed. I wondered if Solomon still prayed alone, not ceremonially, not publicly, but alone, without witnesses, without record. If he still waited in silence, or if silence now felt inefficient. These thoughts did not accuse him, they explained him to me. As for myself, I had changed too. I no longer measured my days by attention or absence. I no longer wondered what place I held in Solomon's mind. That question had loosened its grip long ago. I had learned to live without being centered. That learning had cost me something, but it had given me something too. I had grown attentive inwardly. I listened more closely to my own reactions, my own quiet responses to the world around me. I noticed when my spirit tightened, when it softened, when it rested. I had learned that belonging does not always come from being chosen. Sometimes it comes from choosing where you remain open. There were evenings when I felt an unexpected peace settle over me. Not joy, not fulfillment, peace, the kind that does not ask for more. In those moments, I understood that my life here did not need resolution to have meaning. It had already shaped me. It had taught me patience, restraint, attentiveness. It had shown me how power changes people without turning them into villains. Solomon was not a monster. He was a man who had been given much and had learned to carry it impressively. But impressively is not the same as lightly. One night, I heard him speaking alone in a nearby room, not loudly, not formally, just speaking. His voice was lower, slower. I could not hear the words clearly. I did not try to. What struck me was not what he said, but how long he paused between sentences. Those pauses felt heavier than his speech, as if something waited there. I wondered if wisdom in its later years becomes more about what is not said. I did not move. I did not listen further. Some things deserve privacy, even when they brush against your own life. I returned to my room and sat in the quiet. I felt no urgency to act, no need to change my circumstances. I had reached a place of understanding that did not demand movement. Understanding does not always lead away. Sometimes it teaches you how to remain without illusion. The household would continue. Solomon would continue. History would remember him in ways neither of us could control. As for me, I had learned something quieter. I had learned that being close to wisdom does not guarantee clarity, but living attentively can. And attentiveness, once learned, does not depend on favor, position, or outcome. It remains. So I remained too. Not because I expected recognition, not because I feared departure, but because I had learned how to stand honestly inside a life that did not resolve itself. And that, I found, was enough. I waited. Not for change, not for release, just present in the widening stillness, allowing time to move as it would. There was more ahead. I could feel it, but I did not reach for it yet. By this time, the household had become a world of its own. The courtyards were fuller, the corridors longer, the walls holding stories I would never hear aloud. The voices of servants, advisors, and women alike formed a constant hum, a sound both familiar and slightly distant. It was not lonely, it could not be, but it was a kind of solitude that rests in plain sight, invisible because it asks for nothing. I had grown accustomed to noticing the subtle movements of the household, how a servant's hand hesitated before a task, how the younger women would glance towards Solomon, searching, hoping for acknowledgement, how the older women moved through spaces with ease as though the house itself belonged to them, even when it did not. I had learned where to place myself so as to remain present but unnoticed, presence without intrusion, observation without claim. Solomon had aged more visibly now. His hair carried the faintest streaks of silver at the temples, and his eyes, though still sharp, held a quiet weariness. He walked with measured steps, as if conserving strength for the decisions that never ceased to arrive. When he spoke, his words carried the same weight, yet there was something lighter about them, as if experience had tempered not only his speech, but the way he allowed it to land. People listened carefully. They recorded, they quoted. And I listened too, silently, noticing what went unsaid. I had watched wisdom shift. At first, it had been intimate, almost tender in its reach. It touched hearts gently like the first warmth of the morning sun. Later, it became wide, distributed, diffused, not diluted, just larger. In large measure, wisdom could no longer bend toward one heart without touching many, and with its expansion, it took on a rhythm more formal, more predictable, not less true, but changed in the way it landed upon those who received it. I understood then that nothing lasts unchanged, not people, not households, not even what seems eternal in its early perfection. Yet I remained. I did not leave. I did not withdraw. Presence itself had become a quiet virtue, a daily practice of noticing without demanding, of listening without comment. One evening, I walked through the eastern corridors where the light lingered longest. The lamps burned gently, casting soft gold on stone. The air smelled faintly of incense from the temples carried through open windows. I stopped near a small fountain, a piece of beauty tucked quietly into the architecture. The water moved slowly, without urgency, spilling softly into its basin. It reminded me of the early years, how life could feel gentle and abundant without announcing itself. I thought of Solomon then, not as king, not as a ruler, but as a man who had been given much and carried it as best as he could, a man whose wisdom had once brushed closely against those he led, whose attention had once felt intimate and now necessarily had spread wider than any single room or heart. I did not mourn him, I did not envy him, I simply noticed, quietly, the shape of his life as it had unfolded before me. Among the women, things had shifted as well. Some had grown close, forming alliances that endured the years. Some had withdrawn entirely, existing in the space between rooms and rituals. Some left, sent elsewhere, quietly, without fuss or fanfare. I stayed, not because I had no choice, not because I was necessary, but because I had learned that remaining could carry its own meaning, that witness itself, patient and unassuming, was a kind of belonging. It was during one of these quiet evenings that I realized something subtle yet profound. I had been given a perspective that few could claim, not of power, not of privilege, not of influence, but of observation, of memory, of endurance. I had been near greatness and had learned not to grasp it. I had been near wisdom and had learned not to judge it. I had been near abundance and had learned to measure it inwardly. Solomon still walked the halls, still held counsel, still judged fairly. His wisdom remained, though its delivery had evolved. It was now measured, formal, practiced, but its essence endured. The God of Israel was honored, festivals continued, prayers rose. Nothing of what was sacred had been lost. Only the intimacy of early attentiveness had shifted. I realized then that my own heart had shifted too. I no longer measured my life by the attention I received. I no longer wondered if I mattered, at least not in the ways that defined me. I measured it instead by the clarity with which I could observe, by the steadiness with which I could hold my place, and by the quiet acknowledgement that life, even at its most complex and crowded, could still offer moments of peace. And so I remained, present, attentive, unremarkable, yet fully engaged in the life unfolding around me. I did not seek to shape it, I did not fear it, I simply existed within it, learning the deep, quiet lessons that only time, proximity, and observation can teach. I had come to understand that living beside power is not always about influence. Sometimes it is about witness, about noticing the slow unfolding of life and understanding that even without claim or control, one can belong to it in the most enduring way. And in that quiet belonging, I found my own kind of peace. Not the peace of being chosen, not the peace of being favored, but the peace of knowing, at last, how to stand steadily in a life that does not demand resolution, yet carries wisdom in its unfolding. I remained, and that, I realized, was enough. The years pressed on gently, carrying the household further into its own shape. By now, I could navigate every corridor, every hidden staircase, every quiet courtyard without pause. Yet I no longer felt ownership of any space. Presence had become a practice, not a privilege. I moved among others without expectation, noticing what others overlooked, the subtle gestures, the pauses between words, the way light shifted across familiar walls in ways that revealed time more than activity ever could. Solomon himself had become more distant, not in demeanor, but in presence. He was still capable of listening, still capable of judgment, but his attention was necessarily divided among so many that no single person could hold it entirely. Even when he paused, even when he seemed to lean toward you in conversation, the weight of his responsibilities was palpable. Wisdom, which once descended softly, now radiated outward, broad and unavoidable. I watched him manage his days as carefully as he once had managed a single conversation. Advisors flanked him, scribes recorded his every word, servants prepared for contingencies I could not name. He walked through the household like a measured current, strong, quiet, and precise, but one that could not reach all the spaces it once had. And so the household adjusted. We adapted to his absence in our midst while still acknowledging his presence everywhere else. There was a rhythm to it, a gentle but relentless order, no chaos, no open conflict, only the subtle tension of lives lived close, yet separately. I noticed the small shifts before anyone named them, how a servant's glance lingered longer on an absent favor, how the younger women watched for small acknowledgments that might never come, how the older women moved through spaces with an ease born of long survival. I saw the corridors emptying differently, the laughter coming in softer bursts, the air itself carrying a quiet weight. I did not resent any of it, nor did I grieve openly. I simply noticed. Presence had become my silent companion, observation my work. There was a deep learning in this, about people, about power, about the patience required to endure without complaint or longing. Solomon still demonstrated wisdom, but now it was tempered by scale. What once could touch hearts directly now had to navigate the expansiveness of a household, a court, a kingdom. The depth remained, but the intimacy had thinned. That was neither flaw nor failure. It was consequence, and I carried that understanding quietly within myself. Occasionally, I would find a moment alone, perhaps near the fountains or in a courtyard where sunlight softened the stones just so. I would pause there, listening to the subtle hum of life around me, feeling the current of time pressing against my quiet body. It was in those moments I realized how much I had absorbed, how much I had learned without needing to speak or act. Observation, patience, attentiveness, these had become the core of who I was. Sometimes I wondered about Solomon. Did he feel the same quiet shifts that I felt? Did he notice how attention, when spread wide, can no longer reach each heart fully? Did he pause in his chambers and recall the earlier days when wisdom felt closer, more intimate, more attainable in the air itself? I did not presume to know. I did not presume to ask. Life continued in its patient unfolding. Visitors came and went. Decisions were made. Words were spoken and recorded. Rituals persisted, ceremonies remained precise, prayers rose as they always had. The God of Israel remained central, honored, revered. And still, in the spaces between these movements, I remained present, quietly observing, quietly absorbing, quietly existing in a household that had become far larger than any single person within it. I had learned something profound by this time, that belonging is not always a product of favor, that understanding does not require recognition, that life, when observed with patience and presence, can offer its lessons gently, without demand. I had been given a seat close to greatness, not to claim it, not to influence it, but to witness it, and in witnessing, to understand the quiet rhythms that sustain it. And in this understanding, I found a sense of peace. Not the exhilaration of choice, not the warmth of attention, not the thrill of influence, but a calm, steady acceptance of life as it is. The household, Solomon, the God of Israel, the walls, the corridors, all of it moved forward in a measured, unhurried flow. I did not interfere.
I did not strive, I did not demand. I simply allowed myself to exist within it, attentive, present, quietly steady. The years would continue. The household would expand further and then contract in its own rhythms. Solomon would age more, as all men do, carrying his wisdom and his burdens in equal measure, and I would remain, quietly, calmly, persistently, holding my place, observing the currents, noticing the quiet shifts, learning the subtle ways life moves when power, wisdom, and devotion are interwoven. And in the enduring stillness of my presence, I discovered the simplest, truest lesson, that to belong is not always a product of favor, that understanding does not require recognition, that life, when observed with patience and presence, can offer its lessons gently, without demand. I had been given a seat close to greatness, not to claim it, not to influence it, but to witness it, and in witnessing, to understand the quiet rhythms that sustain it. And in this understanding, I found a sense of peace, not the exhilaration of choice, not the warmth of attention, not the thrill of influence, but a calm, steady acceptance of life as it is. The household, Solomon, the God of Israel, the walls, the corridors, all of it moved forward in a measured, unhurried flow. I did not interfere. I did not strive. I did not demand. I simply allowed myself to exist within it, attentive, present, quietly steady. The years would continue. The household would expand further and then contract in its own rhythms. Solomon would age more, as all men do, carrying his wisdom and his burdens in equal measure, and I would remain, quietly, calmly, persistently, holding my place, observing the currents, noticing the quiet shifts, learning the subtle ways life moves when power, wisdom, and devotion are interwoven. And in the enduring stillness of my presence, I discovered the simplest, truest lesson, that to belong is not always a product of favor, that understanding does not require recognition, that life, when observed with patience and presence, can offer its lessons gently, without demand. The last years arrived without ceremony, carrying the household forward as gently and inevitably as the sun rises and sets. Solomon had grown older now. His hair was streaked with silver, his face etched softly with the lines of time and responsibility. His voice, once carrying the warmth of immediate presence, had settled into a quiet authority, calm and deliberate. He no longer needed to pause to be heard. His words commanded attention simply by existing. Yet in that command there was no harshness, only the weight of a life lived fully, wisely, and under immense responsibility. I had changed too, though subtly, not in appearance, though the years had left their quiet trace, but in understanding. I had learned how to stand steady in the midst of abundance, how to witness without needing to participate, how to hold attention and restraint as gifts unto oneself. My life was no longer defined by proximity or favor. It was defined by presence, by the patient act of being, fully aware, quietly attentive, without expectation. The household moved like a living thing, immense yet cohesive. Each corridor, each courtyard, each room bore its own rhythm, each voice its own place. People came and went, some for a season, some for a lifetime. The younger women had learned their places, the older women their distances. Servants moved with practiced ease, anticipating needs without command. And I moved among them all, invisible in the way one becomes invisible by understanding what truly matters, to exist without disturbing, to notice without intruding. Solomon remained remarkable. His wisdom persisted, though now carried with the measured care of one who understands the cost of abundance. People sought his judgment, his insight, his guidance. They recorded his words, cited them, followed them. And yet I saw what few others did: the quiet vigilance behind the words, the subtle fatigue that comes when one carries the weight of so many lives, so many decisions, so much expectation. I did not pity him, nor did I envy him. I observed, quietly, noting how even the greatest gifts require care. I recognized the cost of wisdom, of power, of proximity to divinely ordered authority. And I recognized, too, how my own place, small, unremarkable, steady, allowed me to see it without being consumed by it. There were evenings when I would walk alone through the quiet courtyards. Lamps cast long shadows against stone. The air carried the faint scent of incense and earth, and the fountains gurgled softly. In those moments, I reflected not with longing or regret, but with calm awareness. I had witnessed a life unfolding, a household expanding, a king growing into the fullness of his calling. I had lived beside greatness without needing to hold it, and in doing so, I had discovered something profound: that belonging is not always about recognition, attention, or favor. It is often about steadiness, witness, and quiet participation. Solomon continued to honor the God of Israel. Ceremonies endured, prayers rose, the household observed the rhythms of faith with care and devotion. Nothing sacred had been lost. Only the intimacy of early attentiveness had shifted, transformed by the passage of time and the inevitability of scale. I had come to understand that life's lessons do not always arrive in dramatic moments. They arrive quietly, in the steady unfolding of days, in the accumulation of small observations, in the patient endurance of presence. I had learned how to belong without demand, how to observe without judgment, how to remain without expectation. And in that learning, I found a profound peace, a calm understanding that even in a life shaped by others, even in a household dominated by power and wisdom, one could find a home in one's own steadfast attention. I stayed. Not because I was chosen, not because I was favored, not because I was central to the household or its history, but because I had discovered the quiet dignity of remaining, because I had learned that life, observed with care, carries its own meaning, its own grace, its own reward. And so I remained, watching, noticing, bearing witness, present, fully present in the soft unfolding of time. I had arrived once with nothing but cloth, instructions, and silence. I would leave one day with understanding, memory, and quiet belonging. And in that, I was complete.